Howdy, friends. Thank you for coming back. Part 6 of Rebel Spurs by Andre North. If you'd be so kind as to smack the thumbs up button and peck it to follow, and leave a comment if you're so inclined. Be much appreciated. Now let's saddle up. It's time to ride. By dawn, Drew had no idea where they were except that they had pushed south. Whether they were now on the range he did not know, and how in the immensity of this hostile country they could fulfill Topman's hopes and lead the troop patrol to Rennie's posse was something the Kentuckian did not even try to answer. The border lay south. If Kitchell had made such a sweeping raid, he would be certain to run the animals in that direction. For the outlaw was fully aware of Rennie's reputation and temper, and he knew that Don Cazar would trail him with set determination. This meant the outlaw must have to set up some plan for avoiding pursuit. Rouse the Apaches, or prepare an ambush. Either could work. Then Bayless' men could be a saving factor. If the Kentuckian could locate Rennie and ride into his camp or skulk close enough to it, that should bring the troops down. But where was Ants? The Texan had not simply cleared out because of imminent trouble. Drew was sure of that. He had followed Shannon to Mexico. This was one time when Drew could well understand the exasperation and frustration felt by an officer whose scouts did not report in as ordered and who had no idea of the disposition of reinforcements. Talk about going into something blind. But still, he rode at a steady mile-covering pace southward. Still south, Teodoro pointed out the hoofprints deep in the soft earth beside the watering hole. Drew steadied himself with one hand on the stirrup leathers as he stood stooped to see him more clearly. He was groggy with lack of sleep and felt that if he once allowed himself to slip completely to ground level, he would not get up again. Rennie's riders? Teodoro was on one knee, conning the mess of tracks as if they were printed page. See, there is the marked Bartolome Rivas horse. It's a misshapen hoof. The shoe must always be well fitted. How far ahead are they now? Drew had come to depend on the young mustanger's judgment. Teodoro apparently was close to a Pima in his ability to read trace. 2 hours, maybe 3, but they'll be at the pass, and there they will stay. Why? I think they will lay a trap for raiders. There has been no sign that they trail now behind driven horses. Don Cazar does not pursue. He rides to cut off the road to Mexico. Kitchell's men, they would not take the open Sonora trail. That is folly for them. So they travel one ridden by men with a price on their heads. If Kitchell now moves south to stay, he will have with him all he can carry, and he must come this way. If he hasn't gone already, there is no sign, Teodoro repeated stubbornly. So we keep on ahead. Drew got down on both knees, splashed the muddy waterhole liquid into his face in an effort to clear his head. They had changed mounts twice since leaving the camp, both times at the water forts on the range, and the second time they had chanced 3 hours sleep and a hot meal. But the rest of the time it was ride, chew on jerky and cold tortillas, and depend on Teodoro's sense of direction to take them eventually to their goal. The outlaws' gate into Mexico. Drew had long since stopped looking over his shoulder for any thundering advance of cavalry. If Bayless was hunting the fugitives, he was not pushing the pace too hard. Not ahead, no. Teodoro drank from his cupped hand. We go so. He sketched a gesture east. Why? It's never well to be shot by one's friends. The mustanger achieved a half smile, stretching the skin of his gaunt young face. Always it is better to see before being seen. When they started, he led the way to the left at a walk. Drew aroused now, looked about him carefully. This was rough country cut by pinnacles of red and yellow rock, backed by the purple ridges of the great heights. It was desert land, too. They had long since left the abundance of the valley behind them. Here was the stiff angularity of cactus, the twisted vegetation of an arid land. The crack of a carbine shattered the empty silence. Drew pulled on the reins as a second shot dug up a spurt of dust just beyond toward Teodoro's mount. "Hold it, right there." A disembodied voice could have come from anywhere, but Drew thought it was from above and behind. Someone holed up in the rocks, had them as perfect targets. The Kentuckian did not try to turn his head. There was no use giving this sharpshooter an excuse. "All right, you." The voice was hollow, its timbre distorted by echo. "Throw off your guns and get down, one at a time, the Mexican first." Drew watched Teodoro slide off the saddle. "Stand away from the hoss, easy now." The mustanger obeyed. "Now you, do just like him." Drew followed instructions carefully. "Hands high, now turn around." They turned. A figure had detached itself from among the rocks they had passed moments earlier and came down toward them, carbine ready. "Ants!" Drew stumbled toward the Texan. The other's hat was gone. A torn shirt, sleeve flapped about on his left arm, allowing sight of a neckerchief knotted around his forearm. His coat trailed from one shoulder. "What in the world happened to you?" Ant sat down suddenly on one of the boulders, his gaze on Drew. He shook his head slowly. "I ain't seeing things," he said. "That's you, ain't it? Say, you got any water?" His tongue curled over his cracked lips. Drew snatched the canteen from his saddle and hurried forward. More than a blood-stained bandage marked Ants, he could see now. He waited while the others seized the canteen avidly and drank. The Texan was smiling at him. "Seems as how we's always meeting up, don't it now? Likewise, it's always to my benefit, too. Only this time I've got me something to trade. You keep on going down this trail, compadre, and maybe you'll wind up with a spade patting you down nice and smooth." "What happened?" Ants drank again with the discipline of a plains rider, a mouthful at a time. "What didn't would be more like it, amigo. Yesterday, well, they got 'em hoss. Tried to get to me. Only left their mark, though," Ants said, regarding his arm ruefully. "I've been wearing off boot heels, hoofing it ever since, trying to make it back to that there watering hole." "Who shot your horse?" "I didn't see no name printed big across his jacket, but I'm thinking it was Shannon." "You were in Mexico?" Ant shook his head. "No, and Shannon ain't neither." "Neither." "I trailed along, riding the high lines, careful. When he went with that there Mex colonel and his men, stayed with him about a day, Shannon did. Then the other man, Anglo, rode into their camp, had him a chin fest with Shannon, and Johnny saddled up pronto. Beat it with the stranger. Thought he might be heading home, but he weren't, so I kept on riding into their dust and waiting to find out what it was all about. Shannon and this hombre, they hit it up pretty good lick till they got well away from the Sonora Trail." Then they skimmed it down till you'd think they had a month and a handful of extra Sundays to get wherever they was going. Plumb wore me down ambling along the way they did. I sure enough about scraped off my hoss boots' hoofs cutting down his speed. Spent a whole day just lounging around in one camp. I'd say they was waiting for someone, only nobody ever showed. So they went on, me following. I'll tell you one thing, this new hombre Shannon took up with, he's a real hard case. Short trigger man if I ever laid eye on one. Anyway, we just kept on, with me trying to think if and I should engine up to get the drop on him or not. Seemed to me, though, as how it might be brighter to kind of just drift their way and see what's making 'em rattle their hawks out in the middle of nowhere. Guess I weren't as smart as I thought I was. As I said yesterday, suddenly they gave the Spurs and lit out. Me, I guess I kinda upset about losing 'em and followed a bit too hasty. Hoss came down with a hole in me. Me, I took another. Gave him a good sight of a man plugged where it means the most, and that must have convinced him I wasn't no problem no more. So, that's what happened. I just pulled as green a trick as a sodbuster trying to crawl a wild one. And where Shannon is now, I don't know, only I don't think it's Mexico. Probably with Kitchell. Hurriedly Drew filled in his own experience and what he had learned from Topham. Ance looked about him. For territory what looked so bare, he commented, this stretch of country sure must have a sight of population wandering around on it. The old man and his posse somewhere's up ahead, and Shannon and the sidekick of his, and Kitchell maybe, as well as the Yankees hot-footing it behind you, or so you hope. Lordy, this is going to be the Battle of Nashville all over again. Do they all meet up? All we need is a couple of bullpups up on one of them ridges, and we could blow 'em all to hell and gone. Just which bunch is going to claim us first? Senors, that is already decided, Teodoro said quietly. Drew looked up. Where had they come from, those four? Out of the rocks themselves? He only knew that now they were here, rifles over their forearms, ready to swing sights on three below. His heart gave a lurch. Apaches? And then, on the far right, he recognized Greyfeather, Rennie's chief scout, and it was Greyfeather who pointed to them and to the way ahead, who gave an empathetic wave of a hand, which was in order. Leading their horses, they obeyed, the Pimas falling in behind. The backdoor route to the pass was a rough one. They had to leave the horses and climb. Two of the Pimas always in sight behind, guns ready, Ance sighed. Seems like we have lots of luck, all of it plain bad. These Injun run us in, and as far as the old man's concerned, we're just what everybody claims we is. We're a couple of saddle bums, as in only those loose 'cause we got up earlier and owned faster horses than the sheriff. How'd we ever get our saddles slipped round so wrong anyway? I did it, Drew said bitterly. It's not of any of your doing, Ance. Tied myself up in a string of lies, and now they have me tight. So help me, Ance, if I ever get this unsnarled, I'm going to open my mouth again and say no more. The Texan laughed. You ain't never been one to color up a story red in a Navajo blanket, and don't take it on the whole pack of this when only about the salt bag is of your buying. You ain't responsible for Kitchell, nor Johnny Shannon, nor Bayless wanting to down the old man. Can't see of how much of this is your doing after all. Rennie had set his ambush at pass with care. At first sight, there was no evidence of men lying in wait, but from the heights over which the Pimas brought their charges, Drew caught a glimpse of men crouched behind shelter and rocks. The bulk of the range posse was gathered in a hollow on the south side of the pass, and it was there that Greyfeather delivered his sketch. Tonkazar surveyed them without interest. Bayless released you then, he said to Drew. No, Reese Topman and the trim fans broke me out. Drew kept to his recent vow of truth-telling, and he noticed with a spark of something approaching satisfaction the truth seemed to be able to shake Rennie a little. Reese Topman broke you out? Why? His demand was quick and to the point. He wanted me to play fox for the Army's hounds, bring the troopers south here, Drew replied. Bayless wouldn't march out, and Topman thought that you needed some support with Kitchell apparently on the move. Telling the truth did not mean you had to tell all of it. There was no reason to bring Shannon into this now and antagonize Rennie all over again. He what? His father was staring at him now with pure amazement. But that doesn't make sense, he added, as if to himself. No, I think it does. Kitchell wouldn't have dared to raid the range if we were going to stay in this country, would he? And after such a raid, he'd head south. You believe that much, or you wouldn't be waiting for him here now. Nobody knows how many men ride with that gang, and maybe he can pull in the Apaches too. They wouldn't pass up a good chance to get back at you. You have the reputation of being about the only white man in this territory to make them turn tail and give up a fight. Now, supposing you do get Kitchell stopped here at the pass and the Army patrol comes in behind him, then together you can finish him, and perhaps some Bronco Apaches in the bargain. It could work. Drew paused and then went on. Of course, I have a good reason of my own for being here, apart from not wanting to swallow Captain Bayless' brand of justice. Kitchell's men took Shiloh, and nobody at all, sir, is going to run off that horse. Not while I'm able to do something about it. Seems to me, sir, Yancey cut in now, that 3 more guns is going to be healthy for you to have round here. Does the fight work out the way it can? Me, I don't want no big brag on my shooting, but I never did wear no 6-gun nor tote no carbine, just for show. Of course, if you think we're Kitchell's plants, Drew added, then keep us under guard. Only we're not and never were. Topman planned this? Rennie still showed surprise. I don't, a bird called fluttingly. Rennie stiffened. Men moved up the slope into cover without direction. You two, get up there behind those pointed rocks, Don Cazar directed with a stab of his finger. I'll be right behind you. We ain't about to give you no trouble, Ant said as obeyed, and Drew agreed as he followed the Texan into hiding. I like a rifle just about now, Ants remarked. Only thing I've ever held against 6-gun is that it don't throw lead as far as a fella could sometimes want it to. But I think we sort of been ruled out of this here fight, lest the enemy gets close enough to spit at. Now they could see down the cut of the pass. The narrow passage would be between the rocks and Drew, though he could not spot them, did not doubt that Rennie's forces were snuggled in where a surprise volley could do the most good. Something sure is coming. Ants had one hand flat on the ground. Feels like the whole dang army's hoofing it fast. Drew was aware of it too, the vibration carrying through the stone and soil, the drumming of hoofs, horses coming at a run. Now it was more than a vibration, a distinct roll of sound magnified and echoed, and that he caught a shout or two, the cries of men hazing on laggards. It must be Kitchell on his way through to the border. A dust haze rising like smoke, then foremost runner of the band appeared in the cut. Whites of his eyes shone, patches of foam sticky on chest and shoulder. 5, 10, even a dozen, but not a gray coat among them. One light buckskin had almost startled Drew into rising until he caught a second and clearer look. The leaders were through. A second wave was coming. Drew counted 20 or more horses before the first rider appeared. His face was masked against the dust by a handkerchief drawn up to eye level. But unlike the ordinary range rider, he wore an army forage cap in place of the wide-brimmed hat of the plains. He was spurred below Drew's perch. He glanced up, but seemed to have no suspicion that he was under observation. There come more horses, and Drew stopped counting, but the gray he sought was not among them. The shouts of the drivers were louder, and then as 3 men appeared bunched, there was a crackle of shots. 2 of the riders fell, one leaning slowly from the saddle, the other driving into the dust. The third tried to turn, but he did not get his horse around before a mule pushed into him, followed by another and another. The horse thieves were trapped. Drew could hear the sharp snap of shots along the pass. More than those 3 must have been caught in that ambush. The mules, braying and running wild, thundered on south after the horses. Then a saddled horse, riderless, galloped by with a second at its heels. Confused shouting rang out with any meaningful words. This was much of a muddle, Drew thought, as any battle. You never saw any action except the immediately about you. Mostly, you're too busy trying to keep alive to care about incidentals. Come to think of it, This was about the first time he had ever sat out a fight, watching it as a spectator. The roll of firing was diving down. Ance grinned at him. "Takes you right back, don't it now?" he asked when he could be heard. "The old man, he's got him some of the general's ideas. We're good, too." "I don't see Shiloh in that band." Drew stood up. "Couple of duns, no grays." "Come to think of it," Ance agreed, "that's right. But look at the bay down there." He pointed to one of the saddle horses and had the dragon rein caught in a dead juniper stump and was trying to pull loose. "Got the double R brand. Some of these must be from the range raid." "Hey down there." The hail broke down the pass from the north. Rennie climbed over his rock barricade, and other men came out of cover to move up the cut. Since no one tried to stop them, Drew and Ance went along. "Got us two of 'em ready to talk." Jared and I strode to meet his employer. "They're Kitchell's gang, all right, only he ain't with 'em." "Patron." For the first time since he'd known him, Drew saw Bartolome Rivas run. He was weaving in and out among the fallen men in the pass. "They ride." He was half choked by the effort to force his message past heavy gulps for breath. "Who rides?" Rennie demanded. 3, 4 men, that way." He waved a plump hand to the east. "They go like the wind on Khazar. And one, he rides the big gray." Drew whirled. The big gray. There was only one horse to be named so on the range. Some of the outlaws had escaped the trap, and one was riding Shiloh. Drew found the horse with the tangled rein, jerked and tore the leather strap, and was in the saddle when a hand caught the rein he had just freed. "Where do you think you're going?" Hunt Rennie demanded. Drew snapped the rein from the other's hold. There's only one thing he wanted to know, and that was getting further and further away with every second he wasted here. After Shiloh, he used spurs on the horse, and it leaped ahead. For all he knew, any one of the posse might take a shot at him, so he rode low in the saddle. He heard startled cries, saw Bartolome Rivas stumble as he got up out of the path of the wild horses. There were rocks, sand, a body which the horse avoided in a leap. Then there was free ground, and Drew settled down to ride. Horse was coming up from behind. They did not think they were going to stop him now. Drew turned his head as the mount pulled level with his own. He was ready to fight if need be, only the man in the saddle was Hunt Rennie. "Better find out which way to go before you break your neck or that bay's legs," Rennie called out. "Beyond the pillar, then east." Drew nodded, but Rennie did not fall back. He was riding his heavy-duty horse, a grulla famous for his staying power, and now the Kentuckian regained his proper share of common sense and began to pull in the bay. His father had pointed out a broken neck or a horse's broken leg was not going to bring Shiloh any closer. He heard the sound of other horses and glanced back as they wheeled around to the pillar to the east. 4 riders were bunched. Ance, Nye, Teodoro, and Donnelly. They made 6 of them in all, pursuing 4 fugitives over miles of countryside, which might have been shaped with no other purpose in mind than to shelter men on the run. But perhaps they could come up with a quarry soon. Shiloh. He had to get Shiloh. Drew began to call upon the horseman's knowledge and scout's lore that he possessed. Those qualities, rather than fighting power, were what he believed he needed now. With luck. Always with a large size helping a luck. "Now that you've bucked out, how about a little sound reasoning?" Hunt Rennie still held his position, riding stirrup to stirrup with Drew. The worst of it was Don Khazar was right. This was no time for raw emotion to replace thinking. Already it was almost dusk, and their quarry could not be traced into the dark, even if they had the aid of the full moon. The Kentuckian reined in. Growing shadows masked the country ahead, rough territory, which he did not doubt the fugitives knew far better than he did. All right. It was difficult, one of the most difficult things he had ever done, to admit that he must follow Rennie's lead. "What do I do now?" "You still think you can go it alone? We don't want to?" Rennie's face was shadow. His voice again held that remote note. "It's my horse." Drew was defensive. Stolen on my range, Rennie retorted. This is far more my fight than yours. If we didn't get Kitchell back there at the pass, I'm inclined to believe that we did not, then I want him. You don't kill a rattler by cutting off his rattles. You go for the head. But this rattler's on his home land, and he knows where to hole up. We have only one card to play against him. What's that, sir? Water. Oh, I know all the rumors that Apaches have secret water holes back in the hills, and they may have introduced Kitchells to some of them. But the hills are behind him. He'll want just one thing now, to get south, across the border. He's lost a large number of his men, probably all of his loot, back there in the pass. He can't hold out here any longer. Once he's into Sonora, we can't touch him. I know he has friends down there. Could he try and take the wagon road south? As a last resort, perhaps. The pass was the only outlet through which he could run, the band's own horses and the pack mules. But there are other places, at least that I know of, where a few men riding light can get through. I believe he'll try to head for one of those. Make it ahead of us now? Rennie laughed shortly. If he does, he'll have a warm reception. The Pimas are already scouting both passes. We plan to close the border when we set up that ambush. Meanwhile, he glanced back. Teodoro, see Don Cazar. How far are we from the hunting camp site? 2, maybe 3 miles, slow riding in the dark, Don Cazar. We'll head there. That, except for a hole behind us which Bartolome will cover, is the only water for miles, and we're between Kitchell and the border spring. One thing he'll have to have is water. We stake out the pools, and sooner or later they will come to us. It made sense, but still Drew was impatient. Out there one of Kitchell's men, or perhaps the outlaw himself, was riding Shiloh. The fact that Rennie's plan seemed a gamble did not make it any easier to follow, but the Kentuckian could not think of anything better to offer. The moon was rising as they came to the water hole near the Mustangers' camp. Men and animals drank together, and when Drew dismounted, his weariness hit hard. Fatigue was a gray cloud in his brain, a weight in his arms and legs and body. Voices around him sounded faint and far away as he steadied himself with a grasp on the stirrup leathers and fought not only to keep on his feet, but awake. What's the matter with you, boy? Drew tried to lift his head, tried to summon words to answer that demand. A sullen kind of pride made him release his hold and stand away from the bay, only to reel back and bring up hard against a rock, grating his arm painfully. He clung there for a moment and got out. Nothing a little sleep wouldn't cure. He spoke into the dark outline of Hunt Rennie. I'm all right. Drew made a painful effort, pulled himself away from the rock to fumble at the cinches of the bay's saddle, only to be pushed aside. Steer him over there. Purse, bed him down. The Kentuckian's last scrap of protest leaked away. He hardly knew when a blanket was pulled up over him as he lay in a rock niche, already drifting into deep sleep. Voices awoke him into the gray of early morning. The light was hardly brighter than the moonlight, but he could make out Hunt Rennie, sitting cross-legged, rifle in hand, while Chino Herrera squatted on his heels before him. Chino had not been with him when they left the pass, and there was Greyfeather, too. Their party had reinforcements. Drew pushed away the blankets and sat up, realizing he was stiff with cold. Fire, hot coffee. There was no sign of either. He yawned and jerked his coat straight about him. His attention suddenly focused on an object which lay on the ground at Cinco's feet. It was a book, the same size as the 3 he had bought at Stein's. Without thinking, Drew moved forward. He was about to reach for the volume when he heard the click of a cocked Colt. A hand swept down on the book. You, hombre, what do you want with this? Herrera, with no friendliness in either voice or eyes, was holding a gun on him. That book, it looks like the ones I bought in town. Drew was startled by the vaquero's enmity. Give it to him, Rennie ordered. For a moment, Herrera seemed on point of open dispute, then he obeyed, but for some reason his weapon remained unholstered. Drew took up the volume. History of the Conquest of Peru, he read out. The binding was a match for that of the other three, but there was something different. He weighed the volume in his hand. That was it. This book was heavier. Well, hombre, you've seen that one before? Yes, this is bound to match those I bought from Stein, and one of those was History of Conquest of Mexico. This is surely part of the same library. Those? What did they have in them? Rennie appeared content to let Chino ask the questions, but continued to watch Drew and the book. Have in them? Drew repeated. Why, pages. They were books to read. The Three Musketeers, The Count of Monte Cristo, and The History of the Conquest of Mexico. That's all, just books. Open this one, Rennie told him. Kentuckian had trouble obeying, and for the first time he did not hold a book composed of pages, but a type of box. The cover resisted his tugging, and then, as if some latch had been mastered, it opened suddenly, and he almost lost his grip on the book. The core of those once separated pages had been hollowed out to contain a nest of raw cotton on which they lay. The Kentucky gasped. Even in the subdued light, those stones glittered, and their settings were gold and silver. Drew saw elaborate pieces, the like of which he'd never seen before. There was a mule shot back in the past, Rennie explained. His pack was open. 3 books were in it. One of them fell and burst open. This one? No. It held a gold coin. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. The contents hardly indicative of the subject, were they? Upon investigation, the wonders of the world produced more coin. And as you see, History of the Conquest of Peru was even more fruitful. You're sure the binding matches that of the books you bought? I'm certain. This was bound to order, as were the other 3. They were part of someone's personal library. Had no bookplate, though. And that was Stein's story concerning them? An old prospector named Lutterfield found them in a trunk in some cave he located out in the desert country. He brought them in to trade for supplies. Lutterfield, Rennie repeated thoughtfully. Yeah, that could be. Trunk in a cave? Herrera was skeptical. But why leave books in a trunk in a cave? One of Kitchell's catches? Or else left by someone who cleared out in 61 and had to travel light. If anything remains, perhaps Lutterfield can locate it for us later. Anyway, this. Rennie took the book box from Drew, clapped the cover over, hiding the treasure. Won't go to Mexico now, and if the owner's still alive, we may even find him. Who knows? You had your sleep out, boy? Drew found Rennie's expression one of indifference. Maybe Don Cazar no longer regarded him with the cold dislike Drew had met at the camp, but they were still strangers. What he had once said back in Kentucky at a remote and distant time was very true now. Maybe Hunt Rennie doesn't know I exist. Maybe we won't even like each other if and when we do meet. I don't know. Now Drew thought he did know. Was this insurmountable barrier all his fault? Because he'd been so sure he wanted to go it on his own, come to his father as an equal, not as a beggar. But could he ever have acted differently? Too independent, too defensive, always. Alexander Maddock had made him like that. Now it seemed that his grandfather had won after all, because his grandson was the kind of man he was. There'd be no meeting with Hunt Rennie to claim kinship, nothing more than what now existed. I'm all right. After too long a pause, Drew replied to his father's question. Do we just keep on sitting here? If necessary, Chino passed those supplies you brought in. We eat cold, at least for now. You look ready to saddle up and ride. Ance was waiting behind Drew's rock. His arm rested in a sling with a neat and reasonable clean bandage about his wound. How's that hole? Drew asked with renewed concern. Nothing much more than a nick. Say, the old man's like a real doc, ain't he? Carries Doc Sings in his saddlebags and patched me up last night, so I'm near as good as new. After I drunk the wrinkles smooth out of my belly and had me some shut-eye, why, I'm right as 4 aces in a man's hand. Of course, I sure could do with some coffee, but strong enough to float a horseshoe, gentle like. But we ain't bending lip over this sun up. Lordy, this jerky sure gives a man chewer's workout. They chewed away at the dark sun-dried carne of the border country. There was about as much flavor in as a piece of wood, but it kept a man's inside busy and about half satisfied. And they did have water. Drew looked out over the land about him. Rennie had their small force stationed to cover every approach to the water hole, and with the Pimas here too, Drew was sure they would not be surprised. Would Kitchell follow the pattern Rennie expected? Try to water here? And then strike for the south? With his men scattered, many killed or taken at the pass, he'd have very little choice. For some reason, the quartet of fugitives must have been trailing quite a distance behind the main band, and so had been warned in time by gunfire. Was one of the four Shannon? And what would it mean to Rennie if Shannon did turn up now with Kitchell? Drew jerked back against the boulder, reacting to a screech from somewhere out in the wild country, a fierce, mad sound which tore at the nerves. He had heard its like before, but never rising so to the pitch of raw intensity. It was the challenge of a fighting sound, one of the most terrifying sounds ever to break from the throat of an animal. From the pocket meadow came the answering squeals of their own mounts, the pounding of hooves as they fought their stake ropes. Don Cazar! It was Teodoro. The Pinto comes and would fight. Again the shriek of rage and utter defiance. The rocks echoed it eerily, and Drew found it hard to judge either distance or direction. The wind was rising too, scooping up dust to throw against the men and boulders. But the wild stud could not be too far away, and what had stirred him into this point of vocal outburst? Teodoro, Rennie recalled. Get back there and see if you can quiet those horses. Drew reached for the carbine he had taken from the boot of the saddle of the captured bay. Army issue. Spencer. He appraised it with a sharp, quick scrutiny of a man who had to depend on enemy weapons before. Just how had this fallen into outlaw hands? The arm was well kept, ready for action. Horses turned man-killer at times, and the Pinto was reputed to be a murderer of his own species. Not just content to protect his band from a raiding stallion, he actually went out of his way to seek and force a fight with other males. Could it be that now the wild killer has been drawn from hiding to meet the strange stallion? And could that stranger be Shiloh? It would mean the men they sought were circling back to this waterhole. Shiloh and the Pinto. Even when saddled and ridden, the Kentucky stallion might respond to the challenge, and so handicapped, he would have no chance. Drew bit hard on his underlip. The yap-yap of a coyote sounded brazenly from the ridge behind, which Drew was almost certain the Pinto had trumpeted. Pass the word, said Rennie. Riders coming.